Hello, my name is Father Christopher Spray, and today I would like to present my capstone project on extremism in traditional Catholic subcultures. I do not intend to label the broader traditional Catholic movement as extremist. In fact, I am myself a traditional Catholic priest. The problem begins when religious identity becomes tied to hostility against an outgroup. By outgroup, I simply mean a person or group treated as outside the trusted community, people of other religions, Catholics judged insufficiently traditional, or outsiders accused of corrupting the faith. This project asks how that shift happens in some traditional Catholic subcultures and how the research helps explain this phenomenon. The research question guiding this project was, how do extremist patterns appear inside some traditional Catholic subcultures, and what psychological and social mechanisms help explain them? The goals are important because this topic can easily become unfair. I did not want to treat all traditional Catholics as extremists. I also did not want to ignore material that is clearly hostile, coercive, anti-Semitic, misogynistic, or conspiratorial. So, the project defines terms first, then connects actual primary source evidence to scholarship on extremism, identity, conspiracy belief, and group behavior. There are many different groups that define themselves as traditional Catholic. Each of these groups has its own particular charism and opinions. It is beyond the scope of this project to describe the similarities and differences between each of these groups. Therefore, a definition of traditional Catholicism is needed that can be applied to the broader movement itself. Traditional Catholicism, as used in this project, means adherence to traditional Catholic belief, worship, and practice as it was before the Second Vatican Council. Religious extremism, as used in this project, means beliefs, attitudes, rhetoric, or behaviors that move beyond the ordinary boundaries of a religious tradition and use religion to justify hostility, coercion, exclusion, prejudice, or rejection of legitimate correction. This definition matters because it separates strict belief from extremist use of belief. A Catholic can hold traditional doctrine, prefer the traditional Latin Mass, and reject modern innovations without becoming extremist. The move to extremism happens when sacred language is used to excuse contempt, coercion, or control. That is why the evidence in this project focuses not on traditional practices themselves, but on rhetoric that turns religious identity into a weapon. A qualitative research strategy is used in this project. That means I am not performing statistical analysis or claiming that the primary sources presented represent every traditional Catholic. Instead, I'm looking closely at selected examples that demonstrate how some individuals within the movement have adopted extremist ideas. The literature reviewed for this project provides insight into the following topics: extremism studies, uncertainty identity theory, conspiracy psychology, social identity theory, Catholic conspiracy culture, and modesty discourse. The primary evidence includes public posts and screenshots involving anti-Semitism, misogyny, sexual coercion, and boundary policing. While the screenshots demonstrate that these patterns exist in selected subcultural spaces, they do not establish how common these patterns are. This project does not attempt to measure the prevalence of these ideologies within the traditional Catholic movement. Rather, it argues that these ideologies can be found in certain traditional Catholic subcultures and that they can be interpreted through a synthesis of psychological and sociological research. Berger's definition of extremism is useful because it shows that extremism is not simply strong belief. Extremism connects the survival or success of an in-group to hostile action against an out-group. An in-group is the community a person identifies with as us. An out-group is the group identified as them. As it relates to this project, the in-group is often imagined as the truly faithful remnant, the Catholics who see clearly, resist corruption, and preserve tradition. The out-group may be Jews, feminists, modern Catholics, clergy, secular society, or even other traditional Catholics accused of compromise. Hogg's uncertain identity theory helps explain why this kind of group identity can be appealing. When people feel uncertain about themselves, the church, society, or the future, a clearly defined group can provide stability and direction. The danger is that the group may begin to offer more than belonging. It may offer total certainty. At that point, rejecting outsiders or dissenters can begin to seem like an act of fidelity rather than a failure of being charitable to others. Conspiracy belief is directly relevant because it can help explain disorder through hidden enemies. Douglas and colleagues define conspiracy theories as explanations for important events involving secret plots by powerful and malevolent groups. In other words, conspiracy theory says that things are bad because a hidden enemy is controlling events. That matters because some extremist traditionalist rhetoric does exactly that. It does not merely say that there are theological or moral errors. It identifies corrupt outgroups as secret manipulators of society, the church, media, or politics. Douglas and colleagues explain that conspiracy belief can serve epistemic, existential, and social motives. Said plainly, conspiracy belief can make the world seem understandable, make danger seem manageable, and make the believer feel part of a group that knows the truth. This slide adds a psychodynamic concept known as splitting. Psychodynamic theory looks at underlying emotional and psychological patterns as explanations for behavior. Splitting means dividing reality into sharply opposed categories: all good or all bad, pure or corrupt, faithful or traitor, victim or enemy. Splitting is relevant because the primary source material shows how some traditional Catholics are not able to handle complexity. For example, a disagreement is not merely a disagreement. It becomes evidence that someone is corrupt. A woman who challenges an extreme gender claim is not simply wrong, she becomes part of feminism or rebellion. Someone quoting from an Israeli news source is not simply treated as using a news source that's open to criticism. It becomes proof of cooperating with Jewish propaganda. Now I'd like to provide a small sample of some of the primary sources used as evidence for this research. The first slide contains examples of misogyny and sexual coercion. The screenshots include denial of marital rape and language that frames sexual coercion as religious duty. This is where the definition of religious extremism becomes concrete. Catholic teaching has a serious moral vision of marriage, sexuality, authority, and family life. But the example shown here is not simple traditional teaching. It uses sacred language to minimize coercion and defend a distorted view of marital authority. The concept of outgroup hostility also applies here, but in a more internal way. Those who resist the rhetoric are treated as contaminated by feminism, rebellion, or modernism. The in-group becomes those who accept the harsh rule. The out-group becomes those who question it. That is how a religious moral topic can become an extremist boundary marker. The anti-Semitic examples here show the clearest link between conspiracy belief and outgroup hostility. Phrases such as Jewish tactics and Jewish propaganda outlets are not simply theological claims about Judaism as a religion. They racialize blame. They turn Jewish identity into a symbol of deception and corruption. This is relevant because it shows the movement from Catholic identity to grievance identity. The speaker is not merely defending doctrine. The speaker is explaining disorder through an enemy group. That fits the conspiracy framework. A powerful, malevolent outgroup is imagined as working behind events. It also fits Berger's framework of extremism. The in-group safety is imagined as requiring hostility toward the outgroup. Once that idea takes hold, prejudice can be presented as discernment, and contempt can be presented as defense of the faith. This slide shows how extremist rhetoric can move from protecting truth to controlling knowledge. In traditional Catholicism, there is obviously a legitimate concern for truth, doctrine, and moral error. Catholics do not have to treat every book, idea, or ideology as harmless. So the issue here is not that a Catholic group wants to avoid error or defend orthodoxy. The issue is what happens when the defense of truth becomes joined to authoritarian control. Altemeyer's research found that authoritarian followers showed a stronger desire to impose censorship. When a group becomes highly rigid, it may begin to treat disagreement, outside information, or correction as threats that must be suppressed. That connects directly to the St. Jerome Library example. The website describes a mission of rooting out heresy, but it also says, "We care so deeply about truth that we have burned thousands of books containing heresy or error." That is important because the language of truth is being connected to destruction. The concern is no longer simply how do we teach what is true, it becomes how do we eliminate what we judge to be dangerous. And therefore, and furthermore, the Catholic Church does indeed allow the teaching of heliocentrism. It's not heresy. This fits with the argument that extremism in these subcultures is not just about having strict religious beliefs. It appears when religious identity becomes closed, suspicious, and punitive. In that environment, censorship and even book burning can be framed as fidelity. But the deeper pattern at work here is knowledge control, deciding what people may read, what they may question, and which sources are treated as dangerous before they are even examined. In summary, this slide shows the mechanism tying everything together. Uncertainty can lead to rigid identity. Rigid identity can define a hidden enemy. Once there is a hidden enemy, purity tests follow. Purity testing then leads to hostility and exclusion. I use identity closure to mean that a religious identity becomes sealed off from correction. The person or group no longer asks, is this fair, true, or charitable? Instead, every challenge is interpreted as proof that the enemy is attacking. Lifton's idea of Milo control helps explain this idea. Milo control means shaping the communication environment, what people see, hear, read, write, and discuss. That concept helps explain why censorship, book burning, purity rhetoric, and conspiracy thinking belong together. They all narrow the world of acceptable information. Once the information environment is narrowed, the group's identity becomes harder, more suspicious, and more hostile. This project accomplished three things. First, it defined traditional Catholicism and religious extremism before analyzing the evidence. Second, it used primary sources to show that extremist rhetoric can be found in selected traditional Catholic subcultures. Third, it connected those examples to psychological and sociological research without claiming that these patterns represent the entire traditional Catholic movement. What I learned is that this topic has to be handled carefully. It is easy to make the argument too broad and to treat traditional Catholicism itself as the problem. It is also easy to make the argument too narrow and ignore harmful rhetoric because it appears in religious language. The better conclusion is that traditional Catholicism is not extremism, but some subcultural expressions of traditional Catholic identity can become attached to conspiracy thinking, identity policing, coercion, and control. The question is not whether a person prefers the traditional Mass, older devotional practices, or pre-Vatican II theology. The question is whether religious identity is being used to justify hostility, scapegoating, coercion, or rejection of correction. That is where the line is crossed. My final takeaway is this. Do not mistake the abuse of tradition for tradition itself, and do not excuse the abuse because it borrows sacred language. Religious communities need a way to preserve what is holy while refusing what is hostile, conspiratorial, coercive, or dehumanizing. The goal here is certainly not to weaken traditional Catholicism. The goal is to distinguish traditional Catholicism from extremist distortions that attach Catholic identity to fear, grievance, control, and outgroup hostility. Truth and charity are not rivals. They are the test. If rhetoric claims to defend truth but produces contempt and dehumanization, it has already failed that test. The better response is to protect the good, name the harm, and refuse to confuse hate with virtue. Thank you.